Imagine spending a decade of your life building a home, only to be thrown out and called useless. That's what happened to Eleanor. Tonight, she's at the biggest business event of the year, surrounded by sharks. But her ex-husband David is here too. He's a rising star, and he's about to publicly humiliate her one last time. He leans into his new boss and, with a sneer, calls Elena his useless wife. He has no idea his boss is about to shatter his entire world with just 6 words. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont San Francisco was suffocating in the scent of old money and new ambition. Crystal chandeliers rained muted gold light onto a sea of black tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns. It was the annual Apex Innovators Gala, an event where fortunes were courted and futures were decided over canapes and $90 glasses of champagne. David Vance felt the familiar acidic thrill of the hunt. At 42, David was the picture of curated success, a bespoke Xenia suit that whispered its price, a Patek Philippe on his wrist, and a precise surgical haircut. He was a senior vice president at Helios Capital, a man who hadn't just climbed the ladder but had kicked rungs out behind him. Tonight, his focus was singular. Marcus Thorne, the firm's co-founder. A partnership was dangling, and David intended to snatch it. "David, darling, you're vibrating," purred Chloe, his girlfriend. She was exactly the right accessory, a 28-year-old PR executive with a razor-sharp wit and a dress that looked poured onto her. "It's the energy, Chloe. This is where it happens," David murmured, scanning the crowd. He networked with the fluid, predatory grace of a shark, his smile wide but never reaching his eyes. He shook hands with a tech CEO, laughed at a biotech founder's bad joke, and mentally calculated the net worth of everyone he spoke to. He was holding court with 2 junior associates, Ben and Greg, who hung on his every word. He was telling his favorite anecdote about a hostile takeover when a shift in the crowd caught his eye. A woman stood near the terrace doors, her back to him. She was talking to a small, intense man David recognized as a venture capitalist. There was something about her posture, a stillness, a quiet confidence that felt jarringly familiar. She wore a simple, midnight blue gown, her dark hair pulled back. No sequins, no plunging neckline. She looked plain, understated. Then she turned, and the champagne in David's mouth went flat. Elena Reed, his ex-wife. A cold, familiar annoyance prickled his skin. It was like finding a mildewed photograph in a pristine, minimalist apartment. Eleanor didn't belong here. This was his world, the world he had built after shedding her. "God, you've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Ben, ever the sycophant, leaned in. "What's wrong, David?" David forced a short, dismissive laugh. He saw his opening. This was a perfect casual display of how far he'd come. He gestured with his chin. "See that woman by the door? The one in the nun's dress?" Ben and Greg squinted. Chloe followed his gaze, her expression tightening. "That," David said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement, "is Eleanor, my first wife, my starter wife." "No kidding," Ben said, playing along. "Doesn't look like your type, man." "She wasn't," David said, louder now, enjoying the small audience. "She was my project, you know, the supportive wife. Kept a nice house, cooked. God, the casseroles." He shuddered theatrically. "She had this little hobby, some gardening app or something. Eco-data. Pathetic." He took another sip of champagne. The bitterness he felt was old, but it still had teeth. The 12 years with her, they felt like a long, boring preface to his real life. She'd been a dragweight. She hadn't understood the hunger required. When he'd left her for a younger, more ambitious colleague who had since been replaced by Chloe, Eleanor had been pathetically broken. "Seriously, what's she even doing here?" Greg asked. "Catering?" David let out a bark of laughter. "Right. Probably snuck in to get free food. When I finally divorced her, I swear, I felt like I'd been released from prison. The woman was utterly, completely a useless wife. No ambition, no drive, just There. Chloe giggled and squeezed his arm. Well, you certainly upgraded, darling. Tell me about it, David said, preening. He was about to launch into another story, the one about her crying over a spreadsheet, when a shadow fell over their small circle. A useless wife, you say, Vance? The voice was quiet, cultured, and carried the weight of absolute authority. David froze. His smile snapped rigid. He turned slowly, his heart lurching into his throat. Marcus Thorne stood behind him, his expression unreadable. Thorne was a man who didn't need to be tall to command a room. His stillness did the work. He held an untouched glass of whiskey, his silver-grey eyes fixed on David. "Marcus," David stammered, his face flushing hot. We were just—" "I heard you," Thorne said. He wasn't angry. He was analytical. He looked past David, his gaze landing on Eleanor by the terrace door. She was laughing at something the VC had said. "You were referring to Elena Reed?" Thorne asked, his voice still level. "Yes," David said, trying to regain his footing. "My ex, ancient history. I had no idea she'd be, well, here." "No," Thorne said, a strange thin smile touching his lips. "I imagine you didn't." Thorne turned his gaze back to David. The analytic look was gone, replaced by something David had only seen him use on rival firms just before a devastating market play. Utter contempt. "Vance, you are a senior officer at my company. I expect you to have done your homework, or at the very least, not be a monumental idiot in public." David's blood ran cold. "Marcus, I don't understand." Thorne took a small sip of his whiskey. "That useless wife is Elena Reed, founder and CEO of Origen Dynamics." David's mind went blank. Origen. He knew that name. Everyone knew that name. It was the white whale of green tech, a company that had developed a revolutionary solar-to-hydrogen conversion technology. They were poised to change the energy grid. Helios Capital had been desperate to get in on their Series B funding round, but they were notoriously private, impossible to get a meeting with. "Origen," David whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Yes," Thorne said, his voice lethally soft. "She's not a guest here, David. She's the guest of honor. She's receiving the Apex Innovator of the Year award. She's the keynote speaker." Thorne leaned in, and David could smell the faint, expensive scent of the whiskey. "And her net worth, after Origen's last valuation, just crossed $1.2 billion. Thorne paused, letting the words hang in the glittering air. "She's not here to impress us, you fool. We're here to impress her." The words, $1.2 billion, didn't just land. They detonated. David's meticulously constructed world, the Zegna suit, the Patek, the ladder he'd bled to climb, cracked and splintered, revealing the hollow, terrified man inside. His hearing tunneled. The joyful chatter of the gala, the clinking glasses, the soft orchestral music, it all dissolved into a high-pitched whine. Ben and Greg had evaporated, their faces pale with second-hand terror. Chloe's hand was still on his arm, but her grip had gone from affectionate to vice-like, her manicured nails digging into his bicep. "Billion?" David echoed. The word was foreign, absurd. It couldn't be. This was Elena. Elena, who wore flannel pajamas and worried about the gas bill. Elena, who cried when he criticized her cooking. Elena, whose hobby was tinkering with solar panels and algae in their damp garage. He'd mocked that hobby. He'd told her it was a waste of time, a childish fantasy to distract her from the fact that she, unlike him, was contributing nothing of value. "Marcus, there must be a mistake," David managed, his voice a strangled rasp. Thorne's eyes were chips of ice. "The only mistake, David, is your catastrophic lack of judgment. You've been trying to get a meeting with Origen's executive team for 6 months. You've been complaining that they won't return your calls." He gestured toward Eleanor, who was now being led toward the main stage by the event's organizers. She moved with an unhurried grace he'd never seen before. It wasn't the tentative, apologetic way she used to walk. It was deliberate. "You've been trying to get my attention," Thorne continued, his voice a low, brutal buzzsaw, telling me you're the man to close the big deals, and all this time you were married to the single most important target on our Western portfolio, and you didn't even know it. Worse, you just publicly insulted her in front of half my staff." Thorne shook his head, a look of profound disappointment settling on his features. It was worse than anger. It was the look a man gives a tool that has just broken in his hand. "You didn't just misjudge her, Vance. You misjudged the entire room. You misjudged me." Thorne didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked away, melting back into the crowd, leaving David standing in a circle of his own humiliation. "David!" Chloe's voice was sharp, a shard of glass. "David, what did he mean?" David couldn't answer. He was watching Eleanor. She was standing by the stage now, speaking with the CEO of a global bank. The CEO was listening. No, he was deferring to her. He was nodding, his body language open and respectful. David's memory flashed, unbidden, to a moment a decade ago. He'd come home from a brutal day at the office to find Elena at the kitchen table, which was covered in diagrams and wires. She'd looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. "David, I think I figured it out. The hydrogen catalyst. If I use a platinum graphene composite, I think I can stabilize the reaction with 80% less energy loss." He hadn't even stopped walking. He'd loosened his tie, tossed his briefcase on the counter, and sighed with exaggerated weariness. "Elena, that's great. Can we do this later? I just lost $500,000 for a client, and I don't have the energy to play with your little science fair project. Is dinner ready?" He remembered the light in her eyes extinguishing. It was as if he'd thrown a switch. "Oh, yes, it's in the oven. Casserole." "Of course," he'd muttered. Now, in the ballroom, the lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the podium. The host, a famous news anchor, began to speak. "Our final award tonight is the Apex Innovator of the Year. This award goes to an individual whose work doesn't just disrupt a market, but redefines our future." David was paralyzed. He was vaguely aware of Chloe hissing his name, of people shifting around him, but all he could do was stare. But a quiet visionary who turned a garage-based concept into a global powerhouse. Please welcome the founder and CEO of Origen Dynamics, Ms. Elena Reed. Polite, respectful applause swelled into a genuine ovation. David watched, his stomach twisting into a cold, wet knot, as his useless ex-wife walked onto the stage. She wasn't the woman he remembered. The woman he remembered hunched her shoulders. This woman stood tall. The woman he remembered apologized for existing. This woman owned the stage before she'd even spoken a word. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled at the crowd. It was a calm, warm, and utterly terrifying smile. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was the same, but the weight of it was different. It was clear, steady, and amplified to fill every corner of the vast room. "I started Origen," she began, her gaze sweeping across the sea of powerful faces, "because I believed in a simple, radical idea, that the potential for change often lies in the very things we're told to dismiss." Her eyes, by pure, cruel chance, seemed to find his. David flinched, as if she'd struck him. "It's easy to dismiss what we don't understand," she continued, her voice resonating with a new, profound authority. "It's easy to label a hobby as a distraction, or a passion as unrealistic. The world is full of voices that will tell you to stay in your lane, to be practical, to know your place." She paused, and the silence in the room was absolute. "Tonight I'm here to thank those voices." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. "Thank them," Eleanor said, her smile sharpening, "because their dismissal was a gift. Their condescension was a forge. It taught me that useless is just a word. It's a label someone else tries to put on you. It is not, and never will be, your reality." David couldn't breathe. This wasn't a speech. It was an execution. And he was the only one on the gallows. Elena Reed adjusted the microphone, her fingers steady on the cool metal. She felt the familiar pre-speech adrenaline, a pleasant, buzzing warmth that sharpened her focus. For a fleeting second, her eyes scanned the dark, glittering crowd and snagged on a face. David. It was like finding a rock in a piece of bread, startling, unpleasant, but ultimately just a rock. The jolt of recognition was real, a cold echo of a past life. He looked poleaxed, his handsome face slack with a kind of horror. Beside him, a younger, shinier woman, his type, looked furious. Elena felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. She felt a brief, cold flicker of pity. And then, just as quickly, she dismissed him. He was a ghost. He was irrelevant. She had work to do. She turned her attention back to the room, to the faces that mattered, and began her speech. Her life now was a world away from the one she'd shared with David. The 12 years of their marriage, in retrospect, felt like a long, low-grade fever. She'd met him when she was 24, a bright, slightly naive PhD candidate in chemical engineering. He'd been a charismatic, driven MBA student who'd swept her off her feet. He'd seemed so certain about everything. She, who was full of questions, had mistaken his arrogance for strength. The early years were fine. She'd supported his burgeoning career in finance, hosting dinners, formatting his presentations, and putting her own research on hold. Just for a few years, he'd said, until I'm established. But established was a finish line he kept moving. First, it was making associate, then vice president, then senior VP. With every promotion, he'd grown more demanding and more dismissive. Her work, her mind, herself. It all became secondary to his ambition. He'd nicknamed her Dr. Dreamer. Dr. Dreamer, are you going to join us in the real world? He'd call out when she was reading a scientific journal. What's on the agenda today, honey? Saving the planet from the kitchen? He'd ask when she sketched out her early ideas for the hydrogen catalyst. The label useless hadn't been a one-time thing. It had been a slow, steady IV drip of poison. He'd wielded it to chip away at her confidence, to make her small, to ensure she never grew large enough to question him or, God forbid, overshadow him. He needed her to be the dull, supportive backdrop for his glittering success. And for a long, shameful time she had let him. She'd shrunk. She'd made herself small. She'd cooked the casseroles. The divorce had been his idea. He'd sat her down in their perfect grey and white living room, the one he'd decorated, and delivered the news like a quarterly report. Elena, this isn't working. I've outgrown this arrangement. My needs are different now. She had been devastated. Not because she still loved the man he'd become, but because the role of wife was the only one he'd left her. Without it, who was she? The divorce settlement was a joke, a calculated insult. He'd hidden his assets, and she'd been too broken to fight. She'd walked away with her old car, her personal effects, and a check that was barely enough to cover a year's rent. He'd called it generous. She spent the first 3 months in a tiny, rented apartment, cycling between rage and a profound, hollow despair. She was 40 years old. She had a PhD she hadn't used in a decade. She had no job, no husband, and no future. She was exactly what he'd said she was, useless. The change came not as a lightning bolt, but as a slow, rising tide of anger. She was unpacking a box labeled garage junk and found her old notebooks, the ones filled with her catalyst diagrams. She saw the notes, the passion, the brilliance that she had buried under years of David's scorn. He didn't just leave her, he erased her. A new, cold thought cut through the despair. I will not be erased. He thought her hobby was pathetic. She would make it an empire. He thought her eco-data was a joke. She would make it the new global standard. He thought she was useless. She would show him. She would show everyone. She cashed the settlement check, every last penny of it. She used it to file her first patents, rent a small lab space in an industrial park in Berkeley, and hire 2 other PhDs who had also been overlooked by the world. She called it Orogen Dynamics. The first 2 years were brutal. She lived on ramen and slept on a cot in the lab. She pitched to venture capitalists who looked at her, a middle-aged woman in a practical blazer, and saw a housewife playing dress-up. The no's were constant, and many were condescending. "This is very ambitious, dear." But her science was sound. Her catalyst worked. It didn't just work, it blew every existing model out of the water. It was cheap, stable, and scalable. Her first yes came from a small, female-led VC firm that actually listened to her. They gave her $5 million. With that, she built her first prototype. 18 months later, a major utility company signed a contract to test her technology. The rest was a blur of frantic growth. The yeses became a flood. Origin Dynamics wasn't a hobby anymore. It was the unicorn everyone was chasing. And Elena found she was good at it, not just the science, the business. The years of watching David, of hosting his dinners and listening to his boardroom war stories had been an education. She had all his knowledge, but none of his reckless ego. She was patient. She was precise. She didn't need to be the loudest person in the room. She just needed to be the smartest. Now, standing on the stage of the Fairmont, she looked out at the sea of faces. She saw investors, rivals, and dreamers. She saw the new world she was helping to build. She finished her speech, her final words ringing with the quiet authority she had earned. The future is not built by those who shout the loudest. It's built by those who listen to the quiet, useless ideas and have the courage to see them through. The applause was a tidal wave. She smiled, nodded her thanks, and walked off stage, directly into the arms of the event organizer. As she was guided back to her table, the head table next to the mayor, she allowed her gaze to drift back to where David had been standing. He was gone. David didn't remember leaving the ballroom. One moment he was drowning, the next he was in the back of a taxi, the humid night air fogging the windows. Chloe was beside him, vibrating with a cold, contained fury. "A billionaire, David." Her voice was a stiletto. "A billionaire? And you called her useless." "I didn't know," David whispered, the words sounding stupid even to his own ears. "You didn't know," she mimicked, her voice rising. "You were married to her for 12 years. How do you not know? Did you think Origin Dynamics just appeared out of thin air? It's been the biggest story in green tech for 2 years. Do you not read your own firm's intelligence reports?" He hadn't. He'd seen the name, of course, but he'd been focused on AI and crypto. Green tech was a soft sector, he'd thought. Boring, like Eleanor. He'd never, not in a million years, made the connection. Eleanor Reed was a common enough name. The woman he'd known simply didn't have the capacity for this. It was impossible. She must have gotten lucky, he stammered. Inherited money, maybe, or married some tech guy. "Oh, shut up, David," Chloe snapped, all pretense of the supportive girlfriend gone. She was a pragmatist. She'd hitched her wagon to a rising star, and he'd just revealed himself to be a burned-out comet. "She is the tech guy. Founder and CEO. Were you not listening? God, you looked like a fool. Marcus Thorne looked at you like you were something he'd stepped in. You're done. That partnership? Forget it." He knew she was right. The ride home to his sterile, glass-walled apartment in the Millennium Tower was silent. Chloe packed a bag as soon as they walked in. "This isn't working for me," she said, zipping a designer suitcase. "Chloe, wait!" he pleaded, the desperation rising. "It's one mistake. I can fix this. I'll talk to Marcus." "It's not one mistake, David," she said, her face hard. "It's who you are. You're so focused on the appearance of success that you missed the real thing when it was sleeping next to you. You're not a shark. You're just a loud-mouthed pilot fish, and the shark just swam away." She left. The slam of the door echoed in the vast, empty apartment. David stood in the middle of his living room, the city lights glittering below him like a taunt. He had everything he'd ever wanted: the view, the apartment, the title, and he'd never felt so utterly, profoundly empty. He went to his home office, his hands shaking, and finally did the research he should have done months ago. He typed Elena Reed Origin into Google. His world tilted. It wasn't just a few articles. It was an avalanche. Forbes, The Quiet Catalyst, How Elena Reed is Solving the Energy Crisis. Wired, The Useless Hobby That Became a $1.2 billion power play. That one, he realized, must have come from an interview where she told them the story. She'd weaponized his own insult. The Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg. He saw pictures of her. Elena ringing the opening bell at NASDAQ. Elena in a hard hat inspecting a new facility in Germany. Elena on a panel with senators, calmly and articulately discussing energy policy. This wasn't his Elena. This was a different person, a stranger who had stolen his ex-wife's face. He found her keynote speech from 3 months ago at MIT. He clicked play. She was brilliant. She wasn't just passionate, she was articulate. She broke down complex chemical engineering and market dynamics with an elegant, simple clarity that was mesmerizing. She was funny. She was confident. He remembered the woman who used to rehearse her order at a drive-thru because she was afraid of holding up the line. He poured a whiskey, then another. He sank onto his $1,000 Italian leather sofa and stared at the screen, a cold dread creeping into his bones. He hadn't just underestimated her. He had, in his arrogance, completely failed to see her. He had lived with a giant, and he'd treated her like a mouse. The power imbalance he'd cultivated in their marriage, it had all been a sham. It was a cheap theatrical trick he'd used to protect his own fragile ego. He'd needed her to be small so he could feel big. He'd needed her to be useless so he could feel essential. But she'd never needed him at all. He'd spent the last 7 years since their divorce telling himself he'd escaped a boring, ambitionless life. He'd pitied her. He'd genuinely believed she was sitting in a sad, lonely apartment, living off his generous settlement, probably still making casseroles. The realization that she had been the one to escape, that she had been the one with the real, world-changing ambition, it was a psychological blow from which he wasn't sure he could recover. His phone buzzed. An email from Marcus Thorne's assistant. Subject, Meeting Orogen Dynamics. David, Marcus has secured a preliminary meeting with the Orogen executive team for 9 a.m. Monday. You will be in attendance. Do not be late. A meeting. It wasn't a firing. A sliver of hope, thin as a razor, cut through his despair. A meeting. Thorne was giving him a chance to... what? To fix this, to use his connection. He clung to the thought. Yes, he knew her. He knew her better than anyone. This was his opening. He could still be the hero. He could bridge the gap, apologize, and be the one to bring Orogen into the Helios portfolio. He would go to that meeting. He would be humble. He would be charming. He would remind her of the good times they'd had. He would fix this. He finished his whiskey, his mind already spinning a new narrative. He wasn't a fool. He was the secret weapon. The Helios Capital boardroom was on the 50th floor, a glass and steel temple to commerce that overlooked the entire San Francisco Bay. It was designed to intimidate. At 8:45 a.m. on Monday, David was already there, nursing a black coffee, his hands clammy. He'd spent the weekend rehearsing. He'd practiced his apology in the mirror. It was humble, self-deprecating, and just a little wistful. He'd even brought up old photos, trying to rekindle some memory of the good times. A trip to Napa, a shared laugh. He was banking on the long-dead embers of their shared history. Marcus Thorne entered at 8:55 a.m., followed by 2 other partners. They nodded curtly at David but said nothing, their faces grim. The message was clear. You are on trial. At 9 a.m. sharp, the doors opened. Elena Reed entered. She was not alone. She was flanked by a severe-looking woman with a leather portfolio, her COO, David guessed, and the same intense VC he'd seen her with at the gala. Elena was wearing a tailored navy blue suit. No dress, no soft edges. This was armor. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore simple pearl earrings. She looked, in a word, formidable. She walked to the head of the table opposite Thorne. Her team sat, opening laptops and files. Marcus, she said, her voice cool and pleasant, thank you for arranging this. Elena, Thorne replied, his own tone one of peer-to-peer respect. We're grateful for your time. You know my partners, and this is David Vance." David felt the spotlight hit him. He stood, forcing his rehearsed, humble smile. "Elena," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. It's been a long time. You look incredible." Elena's gaze met his. There was no anger, no pain, no recognition of their shared past. There was nothing. It was the polite, indifferent look one gives a waiter. "Mr. Vance," she said, with a slight, formal nod. She did not use his first name. She did not smile. She then immediately broke eye contact and turned back to Thorne. "We have a hard stop at 10. I assume you've seen the deck we sent over." David sat down, his face burning. Mr. Vance. She had just neutered him in front of his entire leadership. "We have," Thorne said, gesturing to the main screen. "Impressive projections. We're primarily interested in the new solid-state battery division. Our initial offer for a 10% stake in the Series B is—" "Before we discuss numbers," Elena interrupted, "I want to clarify our position." She leaned forward, and the entire room leaned with her. "Origen is not looking for partners in the traditional sense. We are not looking for synergy or strategic guidance. We are fully funded through our next 3 quarters. Your money, frankly, is non-essential." Thorne raised an eyebrow. "Then why are we here?" "You're here," Elena said, "because your global distribution network is adequate. We're expanding into the European and Asian markets. We are entertaining offers only from firms that can provide immediate, turnkey logistical support. We are not selling equity. We are purchasing a service. If your logistics division isn't prepared to be vetted by my COO, then we are wasting our time." David watched in stunned silence. This wasn't a pitch. This was a dictation. She was setting the terms. She was the whale, and Helios was the barnacle. Thorne, to his credit, barely blinked. "Our logistics are the best in the business. We can provide that." "Good," Elena said. "My COO, Miss Alvarez, will be in touch with your people to begin that process. As for the valuation—" For the next 45 minutes, David was invisible. Elena and her team sparred with Thorne and his partners. They talked numbers, tranches, and exit strategies. Elena was fluent in all of it. She was sharp, she was funny, and she was absolutely ruthless. When one of Thorne's partners tried to lowball a valuation, she simply laughed. "A $20 billion cap? Robert, you're looking at last quarter's data. That was before the German deal. The floor is 30. Take it or leave it." David felt a desperate, clawing panic. He was being erased again. He'd been brought here to be the secret weapon, and he was nothing but furniture. He had to do something. "Eleanor," he broke in, his voice shockingly loud in the quiet, high-stakes volley. Everyone stopped. Elena turned her head, her expression one of mild annoyance, as if a fly had landed on the table. "David?" she said, the name sounding like a question. He forged ahead, ignoring the murderous look from Thorne. I need to say what I said at the gala. It was unforgivable." Elena sighed. It was a small, impatient sound. "I was an idiot," David pressed, his rehearsed speech tumbling out. "I was blind. What you've built, it's a miracle. I was so wrong about everything." He looked at her, searching for the Elena he knew, the one who would forgive, the one who flinched at conflict. The woman across the table simply stared at him. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice flat and cold, "are you under the impression that this is a personal meeting?" No, I just wanted—" "Because your personal feelings, positive or negative, have absolutely no bearing on this discussion. Your apology, while noted, is irrelevant." She turned back to Thorne. "Marcus, is he a necessary party to these negotiations?" David felt the blood drain from his face. Thorne looked at David, his expression one of finality. "No, he is not." "Then I would respectfully ask that he be excused," Elena said, not unkindly, but with the simple, declarative power of a queen dismissing a courtier. "My team and I are discussing sensitive financial data, and I only want essential personnel in the room." Essential, the word he had lived by. David looked at Thorne, pleading. Thorne nodded once. "David, you're excused." It was a public execution. His career, his reputation, his last shred of dignity, all gone. He stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. He buttoned his suit jacket, his hands trembling. He walked the long, agonizing walk to the boardroom door, the silence of the room pressing in on him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He stepped out, and the door clicked shut behind him, sealing him out of the world he had tried to build, and sealing her inside the one she had. Chapter 6. Rock Bottom. David Vance walked out of the boardroom and kept walking. He passed his office with its panoramic views. He passed his assistant's desk. She didn't even look up. He got into the elevator, rode it down 50 floors, and walked out of the revolving doors of the Helios building onto the bright, busy streets of San Francisco. He was a ghost. He didn't go home. He couldn't face the empty apartment, the silence where Chloe's voice used to be. He just walked. He walked for hours until his feet throbbed in his expensive Italian shoes and the fog began to roll in, cold and damp. He ended up at a dive bar in the Tenderloin, a place that smelled of stale beer and bleach. He sat in a dark, sticky booth, ordered a well whiskey, and stared at the flickering TV above the bar. He had lost everything. It wasn't just the job. He knew, with chilling certainty, that his career at Helios was over. Thorne hadn't fired him, but he didn't need to. He'd been excused. In their world, that was a death sentence. He would be sidelined, given no clients, no new projects, until he was forced to resign. His brand was toxic. The man who'd called the most important tech founder in the country useless, his ex-wife no less. He was a joke. It wasn't just Chloe. She was a symptom. He'd cycled through women like her, each one a reflection of his current status. He'd never loved any of them. He'd only loved what they represented. No. The thing he'd really lost was the story he told himself. The story was that he was David Vance, the self-made man, the shark, the winner, the one who had escaped a dull, passionless marriage and built an empire. His whole identity was a high-rise built on that one single foundation, that he was better than Elena. And in one night, in one word, billionaire, she had taken a wrecking ball to that foundation. He wasn't the winner. He was the fool. He wasn't the shark. He was the punchline. He hadn't escaped. He'd been left behind. He'd spent 12 years systematically diminishing a brilliant, visionary woman because her light had threatened to expose his own insecurities. He hadn't just failed to see her potential, he had actively tried to extinguish it. He'd done it out of fear. He'd done it out of a deep, gnawing insufficiency that he papered over with suits and watches and snide comments. He'd called her useless. He downed the whiskey. It burned, but it wasn't enough to burn away the self-disgust. He'd apologized in that meeting, but he realized now that his apology was just another transaction. It was a desperate bid to get back in the game, to regain some power. "Look at me, Elena. I'm humble now. Forgive me so I can feel good about myself. Forgive me so my boss will respect me again." He hadn't been sorry for what he'd done to her. He'd been sorry for what he'd lost for himself. And she'd seen right through it. "Are you under the impression this is a personal meeting?" "Your apology is irrelevant." She hadn't just dismissed him. She had declared that he and his entire emotional landscape had no value in her world. It was the most profound, complete rejection he had ever experienced. It was exactly the same invalidation he had subjected her to for more than a decade. It was, he thought, a twisted kind of justice. He sat in that dark bar for hours, the afternoon turning to evening. He didn't get drunk. He just sat, letting the full, crushing weight of his reality settle on him. He was a 42-year-old man with a hollow career, no real relationships, and an identity that had just been revealed as a complete fabrication. He was, in every way that mattered, bankrupt. For the first time in his adult life, David Vance had no idea what to do next. There was no deal to chase, no ladder to climb, no one to impress. There was just him. And he wasn't sure he liked the company. A thought, small and new, pushed through the wreckage. What if he stopped trying to fix it? What if he stopped trying to win her back, or win Thorne back, or win anything back? What if, for the first time, he just stopped? What if he just accepted it? He'd been a terrible husband, a toxic, arrogant, insecure man. He had inflicted real, lasting pain on a good person, and he had, as a direct consequence, destroyed his own life. There was no redemption. There was no fixing this. There was only acknowledging it. He paid for his drink, walked out into the cold night, and went home. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't check his email. He sat in his dark, silent apartment, and for the first time, he truly, completely let himself be the failure he was. It was, in a strange way, the first honest thing he'd done in 20 years. 9 months passed. The world did not end. It just changed. David Vance was no longer a senior vice president at Helios Capital. He'd resigned 2 weeks after the Origen meeting, taking a small, humiliating severance package. The news of his departure was a tiny, polite line item in the firm's internal newsletter. Chloe, he heard, was already dating a hedge fund manager. He'd sold the Millennium Tower apartment and all the expensive, minimalist furniture that now felt like a stage set. He moved into a small, rented condo in Oakland. It was quiet. It had a view of a brick wall and a sliver of the bay if he craned his neck. He found a job. Not a great job. He was a consultant at a small regional investment firm. The pay was a quarter of what he used to make. His colleagues were young, earnest, and not at all impressed by his past. He wasn't a shark. He was just David, the quiet guy in the decent suit who handled the mid-market accounts. And he was in therapy, twice a week. He was doing the grueling, unglamorous work of unpacking his own toxic masculinity, his father wound, his desperate need for external validation. It was, he found, infinitely harder than any hostile takeover. He learned to cook, real food, not just grilling steaks. He learned to listen, really listen, without formulating his response. He learned to be alone. He followed Origen's rise in the journal. They'd gone public. The IPO was one of the biggest in a decade. Elena's face was everywhere, no longer just on Forbes, but on Time. Changing the world. She was, by all accounts, exactly that. He felt a strange, distant pride, immediately followed by a wave of old, familiar shame. He was learning to sit with both. One drizzly Tuesday evening, his new boss asked him to attend a networking event. It wasn't a gala, it was a new innovators showcase at a co-working space in Berkeley. Startups pitched and local VCs listened. It was small time. It was exactly his speed now. He went, grabbed a craft beer and a name tag, and found a seat in the back row. The first few pitches were rough. A social media for dogs app. A bespoke kombucha delivery service. He was taking notes, trying to find a kernel of something, when the host announced the guest speaker. "We are so incredibly honored to have her. She's a local legend, a true inspiration, and a testament to what can be built right here in the East Bay. Please welcome to mentor our new founders, Elena Reed." David's heart stopped. The small crowd erupted in enthusiastic, adoring applause. Elena walked onto the small plywood stage. She was dressed in jeans, a simple black blazer, and boots. No armor. She looked relaxed, happy. She smiled. A genuine, warm smile that lit up her face. "Hi, everyone," she said, and the room went silent. "Okay, so who's tired of hearing no?" Hands shot up. She laughed. "Good. No is where the fun starts." For 20 minutes she didn't give a speech. She just talked. She told them about her first failed pitches. She told a hilarious story about accidentally setting a small fire in her first lab. She talked about believing in an idea so much that the no's just become noise. She was charming. She was real. She was everything he'd never allowed himself to see. After her talk, she didn't leave. She stayed for the Q&A. She stayed after the Q&A, surrounded by a swarm of young, hopeful founders, all clutching their laptops. David watched from the back. She was patient with every single one. She listened intently to a young woman's frantic pitch about bioplastics, then gently interrupted her. "Breathe," Elena said, putting a hand on the woman's arm. "Your science is good, but you're hiding your why. Why do you care about this? Start with that." She was a natural. She wasn't just a CEO, she was a mentor. She was building a new generation. David felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to run. It was too much. It was too painful to see her like this, to see the good she was putting into the world, a world he was no longer a part of. He stood keeping his head down and made for the exit. He was almost at the door when her voice cut through the chatter. "David." He froze. He turned. The crowd had thinned. She was standing alone by the stage, holding a paper coffee cup. She wasn't smiling. She was just watching him. He walked toward her. It felt like walking across a canyon. "Hello, Elena," he said. His voice was hoarse. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "My new firm sent me," he said. "Scouting." "Ah." She nodded. She looked at his simple, off-the-rack suit, his new, modest watch. She looked at his face. He knew he looked older. He looked tired. An awkward, heavy silence stretched between them. The ghosts of 12 years of marriage, of betrayal, of public humiliation, all stood in the small space between them. He had to say something, not the transactional apology from the boardroom, but the truth. "What you've done," he said, his voice quiet. "It's incredible, Elena. I read about the IPO. Congratulations." "Thank you," she said. "And that woman you were just talking to, the one with the plastics pitch, you really helped her. That was kind." Elena looked at him, a long, searching look. He met her gaze. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just stating a fact. She seemed to find what she was looking for. The slight, guarded tension in her shoulders eased. "I had a lot of help," she said, "from people who believed in me when others didn't." The old David would have flinched. The new David just nodded, accepting the blow. It was true. "Yeah," he said. "Are you?" She started, then stopped as if unsure. "Are you doing okay, David?" The simple human question almost broke him. It was the first time she'd shown him anything other than indifference. It was a single, tiny spark of, not forgiveness, but humanity. "I am," he said, and he was surprised to find he meant it. "It's different. I'm different. I'm working on it. It's quiet, which is good, I think." She nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Good," she said. "I'm glad." There was nothing else to say. The chasm was too wide, the history too heavy. "Well," he said, gesturing toward the door, "I should let you go." "Okay," she said. He turned to leave. "David?" He turned back. "Good luck with the scouting," she said. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't an invitation, it wasn't absolution. It was just two people, two survivors of a wreck, standing on different shores, finally acknowledging the other was still breathing. For David, it was more than he deserved. It was everything. "You too, Elena," he said. He gave her a small, respectful nod. She held his gaze for a moment, then gave a single, brief nod in return. He walked out of the co-working space into the damp Oakland night, leaving her to her new world, and finally ready to start building his own. Elena watched David Vance walk away. The man who left was not the man who had entered. The arrogant, predatory swagger was gone, replaced by the careful, deliberate steps of someone who'd been broken and hadn't quite finished putting himself back together. She'd heard he'd left Helios. She'd heard he'd sold his apartment. She hadn't, until this moment, realized what that meant. He'd lost the shell he'd lived inside. She'd spent years dreaming of this moment, of a final confrontation. In her fantasies, she was cold, powerful, devastating. She would list his every sin, every casual cruelty, every time he'd made her feel small. She would make him small. But seeing him in the back of that room, in his ill-fitting suit, looking so ordinary, the anger she'd carried for so long just evaporated. It felt, she realized, as pointless as being angry at the rain. He was no longer the monster in her story. He was just a man, a sad, failed man who was, it seemed, trying to be better. When he'd apologized in the boardroom, she had felt nothing but contempt. It was a ploy. But this congratulations, that was kind. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged her for who she was, without it being about him. "Are you doing okay, David?" She was surprised she'd asked, but the question had been genuine. Her therapist had been pushing her for months to move from anger to acceptance, to see David not as the villain who had forged her, but as a deeply flawed person who had been a chapter in her life. A painful, destructive chapter, but one that was, nonetheless, over. His answer, "I'm working on it," was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. She'd meant it. She was glad. Not for him, necessarily. But she was glad that the raw, toxic anger he'd embodied was no longer a force in the world. A young man with a wild beard and desperate eyes approached her, holding a tablet. "Ms. Reed, I'm sorry, can I just have 2 minutes? I have a vertical farming algorithm." Elena turned away from the door, giving the young founder her full, undivided attention. "Okay," she said, smiling. "Show me what you've got." David walked for a long time before catching the BART. The train was mostly empty, rattling its way under the bay. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. He saw a middle-aged man. He saw the new lines around his eyes. He saw the grey in his hair. He didn't see a shark. He didn't see a winner. He just saw David. He'd gone to that meeting expecting, he didn't know what, a fight, a final, crushing rejection. He'd gotten something far more complicated. He'd gotten peace. Her small "I'm glad" was not forgiveness. He knew with an aching certainty that he would never be and should never be forgiven for the years of psychological damage he had inflicted. That wasn't his to ask for. But her question, "Are you okay?" It was an acknowledgement. It was a release. She was no longer defined by his cruelty. And perhaps he was no longer defined by it either. He'd spent a lifetime building his identity on a foundation of power over his colleagues, power over his women, and most of all, power over Elena. She'd spent her new life building an identity on the power to create, the power to innovate, the power to mentor. He finally understood. He had never been the powerful one. He'd just been the loudest. He got off the train in Oakland and walked the quiet blocks to his condo. He went inside, took off his coat, and did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his old personal email account, the one he'd used when he was married. He found the email he'd drafted in a fit of self-loathing right after he'd left Helios. It was a long, rambling, multi-page confession of all his sins, a pathetic plea for forgiveness. He'd never sent it. He looked at it now, this monument to his own self-pity. He highlighted the entire text and deleted it. He started a new email. The to field was elena.reed@gmail.com, her old personal account, the one he'd called useless. He had no idea if she still checked it. It didn't matter. He typed one sentence. "I am glad you're in the world." He hit send. He closed the laptop. He felt no relief. He felt no joy. He just felt quiet. He had work tomorrow. He had a mid-market account that needed reviewing. He had to go grocery shopping. His life was small, and for the first time it was real. David's world was built on a lie, the lie that Elena was worthless. It took one night to shatter that illusion and a lifetime to find redemption. This story shows that the people we underestimate are often the ones with the most power, hidden just beneath the surface. What did you think of David's journey? Was his redemption earned, or did Elena deserve more? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.